Hello everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Back to Watercolors. I'm so happy you are here, and I briefly introduced all of you in the last episode my primary watercolor palette that I put together a couple of months ago. I've used this particular palette for maybe 2 months, and I filmed this kind of brief paint pour and color selection months ago, but I never found a way to show it in any of the art vlogs. So I thought to kind of introduce you to this palette, I would give you a brief look into what colors I selected, mixing them, and then placing them in my palette. After months of researching pigments and looking into what other artists had in their watercolor palette, I only bought colors that I thought I needed and wanted to test out by Daniel Smith. And then I did also pick up a couple of Holbein watercolors, and then majority of the other colors that I selected for this palette were for my Magello Mission Gold 24 pack of watercolors. I wish to make it clear that I encourage all of you to use what you have available. The only reason why I ended up purchasing more watercolors instead of just reaching for what I had in my collection is because my collection is very small. I only had Magellan Mission Gold watercolors, and I would like to expand into the watercolor realm a little bit. That's kind of the point of this episode and series. I wanted to explore having a primary skin tone mixing formula with my watercolors, so that's why I opted into buying more Daniel Smith watercolors, because I needed something to replace my workflow with gouache. I just didn't like granulation in my skin tone mixes, and because I use gouache so watered down, I figured that maybe watercolors was the right way to go and explore what it means to make a new watercolor palette. For this new palette that I am creating for this video, I went in thinking that I needed a solid split primary set. I didn't really have that, and I feel like it's holding my art back in a way because I don't really understand what it's like to mix with a split primary set. I don't know what my split primaries are really, like the pigments and what to look for and how they mix together, and I feel like that's kind of a fundamental watercolor or even like artist knowledge that I needed to work on personally. So that's why I went with the Daniel Smith Essentials set, because it had a very solid primary set, even though I could have probably picked out colors from my Magellan Mission Gold set. I just really wanted a solid, I know this is good primary set, because I just don't really know what pigments to grab from my Magellan Mission Gold set of watercolors. I wish I did start out with a smaller set instead of the Magellan Mission Gold 24 count. Not that I regret having those watercolors, it's just that I was missing that fundamental knowledge of how to mix with primaries because I was overwhelmed with so many colors that I think that's why I took a step back from using watercolors, because I just didn't know how to use them, what pigments did what granulation was. I was just mixing colors and having fun, which is a really great thing, and I don't regret that part of my art journey, but I do regret that I didn't start out with something that was very obviously a really good primary set. In today's video, I'll be setting up a new palette to use as my primary palette for color mixing and skin tone mixing. I want to be able to just rapid fire, use those colors, know what I'm using, and feel comfortable with what color mixing really is. And just look at how beautiful, juicy, I don't know, like they're just so beautiful, pigmented watercolors. I'm really excited to use them. I feel like when you are excited to use the supplies that you have, you're more inclined to use them. So, I don't know, just something about there's something about watercolors and the way that they move, the way that they react to water. It's really exciting, and I'm excited to use these paints and get better in my color mixing. As a primary illustrative portrait artist, I felt I needed a solid skin tone mixing formula. So that's why I delved deep into like what colors I can use that are non-granulating that will yield me what I needed, and then just go from there instead of, purchasing more colors, because I do want to use what I have, and I'll explain more about it once I show you the colors that I selected. I feel like I've learned so much while using gouache that I know that I don't enjoy painting faces with gouache. Most of you who have watched my videos for a long time have noticed that I use gouache very watered down, almost like watercolors when I paint the face. And because a lot of my skin tone mixes contain ultramarine blue, I often end up having granulation, and I didn't really like that. So to eliminate one aspect, I delved deep into pigment properties, looking into what my other favorite artists were using, and I selected a couple of colors that would be my primary skin tone mixing setup for my watercolor palette. Which leads me to my new palette. The main goal of this new palette is to have a solid primary set and a solid skin tone set that I can use as a formula to yield the results I like. I've completely X'd out granulation from my skin tone colors, and it was such an amazing and fun process to dive into brands and pigments and just learn and observe what happened when I did mix this color with that color. And I don't know, I just really just think pigments, and then when you look into them, how much they differ between brands, between individual paints that are in the brand. I just think it's so interesting and fun. It's like kind of collecting all the different types of hues and colors that you can find. As I explore watercolors and get used to my new custom watercolor palette, I hope to continue to adjust and grow as an artist and make changes to it, but I do want to use up the paints that are in the palette before I decide to move on to another color. Before I commit to any colors, I squeezed out just a little into my ceramic palette, because you never know until you squeeze out a huge glob into a main palette if these colors are what you want, what you need, so you don't make any mistakes when you're setting up your palette. For example, also a little bit of a spoiler, I did end up changing the arrangement of my split primary set to better help my understanding of warm and cool colors, and even then I still made a mistake. But I have it mentally like what is a cool blue versus what is the warm blue in my palette, and I just needed to adjust that later on once I use up the paints that's in the palette. Perylene green was a color I've been infatuated with for maybe a month now. I've learned it's non-granulating and can be used for shadow shapes in florals and in skin tone mixes. So I hope to use that and explore more with it in my skin tone mixing palette. The only problem I was facing was when I was using a database, I noticed that these three brands of Perylene green all were slightly different but also similar. But when I bought them and swatched them, and I'm glad I bought small tubes too, because I realized that they're pretty much the same. I mean, to me, you can chime in if you notice any differences between the three different Perylene greens that I have, but to me they all kind of look the same and work the same, and when I pull them from my palette I don't see much of a difference versus one or the other. So I chose one of them, and I will explain why I chose that one when we get to putting the paint in the palette. But I don't know. I'm glad I have all three of them to test them out, but I feel like they're all pretty much the same. It took me a long time to figure out what painting I wanted to use for this episode of Back to Watercolors. I've had this sketch on my wall, just, waiting to find the time to paint it for a long time, almost 4 months now. I think I showed a little bit of the sketch in my January art vlog as one of the goals that I wanted to achieve this year was to paint more full figures and get comfortable painting anatomy and just drawing anatomy in general. I don't think this painting was a huge success. I would like to revisit this concept in a way that is super comfortable for me, so like in a portrait setting, because I'm more comfortable painting portraits than anything else. And it is definitely like a weird thing for me to say that like portraits are my comfort zone, because I remember a year ago, 2 years ago, portraits was not something I was super confident with painting. I didn't like how my features were coming out. I felt like everything just looked wrong. So it's really weird after putting in the work for about a year that portraits have become my, safe zone and the main feature of a lot of my paintings. And I would like some more figure work to be added to that portfolio as well. I just need to, find the time and dedicate a good length of time to study figures and get better at just drawing more full figures. That's why I decided to paint this sketch for this episode, because it's just been sitting on my wall for about 4 months, and I was just telling myself, when am I going to paint this? When am I gonna just try? Even if I fail, at least I tried. And do I love how this painting turned out? No, but there's certain parts of it that I do love and that I would like to bring into more of a safe zone portrait painting of this concept. This sketch means so much to me, but I felt like I just couldn't get what I wanted out of it just because of my skill level. And also I decided that I wanted to go fully into painting it with watercolors, so I only used gouache in a couple of spots. For the skin tone, I just used primarily my main watercolor palette, and then for the background I used Perylene Green, Ultramarine Blue, and a sample dot card that I received. And I used a couple of those sample dot cards because there was so much paint in them that I just didn't want them to go to waste, so I wanted to find a way to incorporate them into my art practice. I didn't really think about how much purple I was adding into this painting, so I've started scanning in my work and editing it so I can add it to a portfolio and maybe possibly make some prints in the future. And I realized that purple just doesn't scan, or like I can't edit it correctly, and maybe I just need to look into it more. But I don't know, I find myself trying to avoid purples in my work, but I'm so attracted to like purple. I don't know, like purples and blues I'm very attracted to in my artwork and just other people's artwork, but I'm having trouble like scanning in and editing purples. On one hand, I want to avoid purples, but on the other hand, I'm just gravitating towards them. And so I didn't intentionally think that this was going to be like a purple heavy painting. It ended up being a very heavily purple leaning painting. I'm just curious of how it's going to turn out when I put it in my scanner. I think the biggest issue I had was painting the bird of paradise flowers. So originally this whole painting was supposed to be in gouache. So I had an idea of how I was going to paint the leaves and the flowers in gouache, but because I decided to at least put the first foundational layer in watercolor, I think after I was done, it just wasn't exactly how I pictured everything to be. And that's because majority of this painting is in watercolor, and then so my eyes just have a hard time adjusting to a very watercolor heavy piece. I used gouache in very select few places, and I did go over some of the leaves and flowers in gouache, but I didn't go super heavy with the gouache. I just tried to solidify some of the colors that are already put down in watercolors. And I was very impressed by like just the amount of different colors I could mix with this essential kit. I had so many different purples and blues and greens that I could mix with that I had no idea was even possible. So I think that's kind of what threw me off too, because I just didn't know what these colors could do. I was figuring it out and finding it out in the moment on this painting. And I don't recommend doing that because you just don't know. You don't really know what colors you're gonna get, and how it's gonna all turn out. And I think that's why I'm just a little disappointed in this painting. I think if I could just cut out the bird of paradise flowers, I would be happy with this painting. But I just can't because it's just a part, it's an essential part of the painting. So that's why I would like to go back and revisit this concept because I do really love this concept. It means a lot to me. Bird of Paradise flowers just have like a very special meaning to me, and I want to do this concept, this idea justice, and I don't feel like I really did it justice in this painting, but just which is okay. I'm perfectly okay with just having a fun figuring it out painting, and I definitely think this was a fun figure it out painting. There's a lot of things that were overlapping. There was a lot of different color changes, and I was, enjoying the moment even if I just didn't love the outcome. So while painting the bird of paradise flowers, I wanted to give myself a time limit like I did with my last painting, just spend about 4 hours working on this painting. Nothing too serious, nothing too lengthy. Um, but it ended up running a lot longer than that. So I did skip ahead and show you some transitional parts of the painting. I just, put on a show on Netflix called Beef. It was it was pretty hilarious. I loved it, and it was nice to see the actor from The Walking Dead, the actor that played Glenn. I can't remember his like real name, but it was just so nice to see him in something and just a different character. And I had fun watching the show while I was painting. So yeah, I was a little bit distracted throughout the painting, but I loved it. Like, look how beautiful the color mixing is. I just didn't love it. I love the colors, I just don't love the outcome. Um, After this painting, I decided I was going to go ahead and make my new watercolor palette. I started out with my Daniel Smith Essential Kit. So all the colors from the Essential Kit are in this palette. And while I was looking into which blue to use for my skin tone mixes, it was I was stuck between turquoise blue and manganese blue hue. Manganese blue Nova. And while I was doing some research into the pigments, I realized that phthalo blue and manganese blue were basically like the same pigment. One is just more green leaning and one is not. And it just threw me for a loop. I did some color mixing tests, and I felt like I was getting the same like color range for my skin tone. So I decided to go with manganese blue Nova from Holbein. And I don't know, I might not keep it forever in my palette. I just have a very small tube of it, so once I run out, I don't think I'm gonna pick up that color again unless I find another way to use it other than my skin tone mixes, because I think my phthalo blue can fulfill that role for me just fine. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting and a little quirky thing to share. Okay, so for my new main watercolor palette, I have Haza Yellow Light from Daniel Smith, New Gamboge from Daniel Smith, Pyro Scarlet from Daniel Smith, Quinacridone Rose from Daniel Smith, French Ultramarine from Daniel Smith, Phthalo Blue Green Shade, Daniel Smith, Quin Coral, Daniel Smith, Nickel Azo Yellow, Daniel Smith, Green Gold, Daniel Smith, Quin Gold Deep Core. I also added Burnt Sienna by Magellan Mission Gold just to kind of help deepen my skin tone mix. Manganese Blue Nova by Holbein. And out of the three Perylene greens, I chose Shadow Green, also known as Perylene Green from Holbein. For some just fun mixing, I chose Yellow Ochre from Magellan Mission Gold, Lavender from Daniel Smith, and Wisteria from Daniel Smith. So after having lots of mixing fun, you're probably wondering why I chose Core Quin Gold Deep instead of just going with Quin Gold from Daniel Smith. And the reason why is because when I looked up the different pigments, I realized that Daniel Smith also has the same pigment Nickel Azul Yellow has, and the same pigment as Quin Gold Deep has, and I wanted a deeper color to mix skin tones with. So Daniel Smith Quin Gold was just too light for me, so I decided to go with the deeper core color and added Nickel Azul Yellow into the mix just in case I wanted to lighten up that orangey color that I have for skin tone mixes. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of Back to Watercolors. Out of the lineup of colors that I selected for my second main watercolor palette, which color did you like the most? I do notice that a lot of watercolor artists have green gold at least once in their palette, so let me know. Let me know which one was your favorite color or which color you would like to choose or try out for yourself. All right? I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye. Take care.